What do you know about the causes and effects of an absorption into a society? Hello, my name is Tony Huante, and today I will be discussing Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States, published by Beacon Press in 2014, and Howard Zinn's book, A People's History of the United States, published by HarperCollins Publishing in 2015. We will be comparing the conflictual causes and effects of Native Americans and early European arrival to the Americas. In the past, we've seen the face of America change through the absorption of majorities of populations growing and lessening. Since the arrival of Christopher Columbus in October 12th, 1492. First, we will discuss how 90% of the Native American population was wiped out from early European integration into the Americas. Secondly, we will compare that with the needs and desires of the early Europeans' arrival in the Americas, their perspectives more or less, what they had to deal with. And thirdly, I will be explaining my ideas and perspectives on why these cultural issues grew between Native Americans and early European colonists. To start this off, in the book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States, published in 2014, over 500 Native American nationalities, with about 3 million survivors still remain since early European arrival in the 1500s. Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz notes how over 500 Native American federally recognized tribes with about 3 million survivors are left from the 100 million Native American population that existed prior to the 1600s, and how most died to disease and most of the rest died from conflicts that arose between Native Americans and early Europeans. So, in the book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States, by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, I cite her words: the total population of the hemisphere was about 100 million, with about 2/3 of that being in North America, including Mexico. She later notes how smallpox, yellow fever, the flu, these diseases really decimated the population. Secondly, in the book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States, Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz also notes how there were centuries-long genocidal programs conducted by the early European settlers, colonialists by then actually, to mislegitimize the seizing of land and the genocides of Native Americans. And programs such as missionaries that had occurred in New Mexico, and a lot more that were omitted from history through the misinformation throughout history. Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz also notes in her book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States, how early Native America, prior to European intervention, was mostly a disease-free space. And Native Americans would conduct sweat baths in order to expel impurities. Now that we have discussed the Native American perspective of early European intervention into the Americas, let me continue by explaining the early European perspective along the lines of survival and necessities and desires to live and survive. So, in Howard Zinn's book, A People's History of the United States, Zinn is translating Christopher Columbus's log in some parts. And through that, we were able to find out how new settlers to the Americas from Europe were mostly aristocratic, even their servants. So they didn't tend to really enjoy or find enjoyment in working the lands, doing the labors, which set an early example for the developing Americas in enslavement and indenturement. Also from the book, A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. Zinn translates Christopher Columbus's log, and in which Columbus writes, "With 50 men, we could easily subjugate them all and make them do whatever we wanted." This was another example which, by Christopher Columbus doing this, set forth more and more terms for people wanting to conduct enslavement, for labor, for exotic trading. Lastly, from the book A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, published in 2015, Zinn writes how there was this one nation, the Arawak Nation, for example. They greeted Spaniards with food, water, and gifts. In return, though, the Spaniards enslaved them, and this led to in which 250,000 of them committed suicide through a poisonous concoction called cassava. They were very afraid of enslavement in the sense of anyone who fled these forced labors by the European colonists and settlers and explorers. They were faced with, if they were caught, beatings, sometimes being murdered, a lot of times being murdered actually, and but in some cases being fed to the Spaniards' dogs. Now that we have discussed early European arrivals, perspective, necessities, desires upon coming to the United States, and some of the lasting effects since then contributed by them, let me continue by discussing my perspectives as to why these conflicts arose between Native Americans and early European arrivals to the Americas. So, in both books, An Indigenous People's History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz and A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, I would like to share some of my ideas as to why there was such conflicts between these two different cultures. So, in Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States, published in 2014, it's noted that Native Americans were a communal people. They shared things with each other, and they were agricultural peoples. They really tended to the land. That was what their specialties more or less were, being one with the world that they lived in. While in A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, I find that the European arrivals, along with Europe concepts, was not the same as the Native Americans. The Europeans believed in private landowning, they believed in indenturement, servitude for either freedom or a type of skill to be something, which, comparing both of these, upon the European arrival to the United States, they suffered from starvation. They didn't really have the agricultural skills to make life happen through food and sustaining themselves, which led to seizing of land of Native Americans, burning of bushels and other of corn and other products by the Native Americans. But they didn't mind taking some of these and taking them back, products and taking them back to Europe. For example, the potato. Ireland, Dutchland, parts of Europe wouldn't today probably even exist without the potato, which came from North America. They didn't tend to their lands the same as the Native Americans did, so the land was really malnutritioned. There was a lot of disease in the land and in the peoples, which wasn't really an issue in Native America. Today we have discussed the causes and effects of Europe into the Americas, the absorption and growth of European majorities, and the Native Americans' absorption into that through miscegenized genocides, through diseases, wiping out populations. And since the arrival of Christopher Columbus in 1492, October 12th, the lasting effect of these actions and examples set by these early explorers and colonists. So, first I explained the near extinction of 100 million peoples Secondly, I explained the European perspective upon arriving to the Americas and their desires and needs to survive and grow. And lastly, I explained my ideas and perspectives as to why these conflicts arose through differences, which led to the Native American population's absorption into today's America over a span of about 500 years. Now, let me leave the speech with a memorable statement from A Game of Thrones by George R. Martin, Valhar Morghulis Valhar Dohirs, which means all men must die and all men must serve, since we all die no matter what, but we serve for the story of our lives that we live.